Liberal Viewer presents.
So, welcome to Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out, I think, 40 of the weekend's best clips for what should be a really interesting show for you tonight. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. I'll also have several political comedy clips, most from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday, and then one from last night's Saturday Night Live Weekend Update. You can see all the topics I'm covering listed down in the video description, and as usual, if you're watching this as a recorded show, you can see time indexes down there to skip to the topics that most interest you, though almost all the clips will be on the main topic, with just one near the end on the Nepal earthquake, a few on Senator Bernie Sanders entering the Democratic presidential race for 2016, challenging Hillary Clinton from the left, and then a couple at the very end on New Jersey Governor Chris Christie's Bridgegate scandal. But I'm going to start with a topic that's been dominating the news all week, the protests in Baltimore over the in-custody death of Freddie Gray from a severed spine, and the charges against the 6 officers involved from the state's prosecutor for Baltimore that were announced on Friday. I'll have more of an overview of the incident in the context of the ongoing problems with cops and race and the criminal justice system. And if you want to see an edited, produced video I made a while back giving even more of an overview on that topic, you can check out the link in the video description to my video, Cops, Justice System, Racist, Classist, or Both. And before I get to the context, though, I want to address what happened in Baltimore last week. And I want to start with Bill Maher's, one of Bill Maher's monologue jokes from HBO's Real Time last Friday about how the police in Baltimore were trying to make up excuses for what happened, over in this clip.
The police in Baltimore are not happy about this coming down from the prosecutor. I saw the head of the police union today said they did nothing wrong, as always, infallible, do it by the book. Well, they have their own version of what happened. They say, first of all, Freddie Gray was resisting not being dead. That's number one. And he may have been trying to frame the cops by beating himself to death with a car. And the violent shaking that happened to him was because of the earthquake in Nepal. So you have to look at these alternative versions.
Now, I'll get into some of the excuses from the police a little later in the show. But one of the first things I want to do on this topic of what happened in Baltimore after showing that joke, because I always like to start the show with one of the political comedy clips, is compare the way the different networks did their overviews of the situation in Baltimore. I'm actually going to have something from ABC, from CBS, from NBC, sort of from CNN, and then Fox News, of course, has its own different take that I'll get to at the end. But first, here's the overview of what happened in Baltimore from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos from their reporter Jim Avila over in this clip.
Good morning, George. The protests and marches continue here, some of them large in size, but mostly peaceful. The real trouble coming mostly at night, at curfew time. Overnight, a curfew still in effect. More protests, and Baltimore's police commissioner saying he'll wait for the investigation to proceed.
And now we'll have the confidence that the truth will come out and the truth will overcome for all.
All of it sparked when Baltimore stunned itself and the nation. Its youngest chief prosecutor in the country, 35-year-old Marilyn Mosby, announced that she wants to put 6 of her police officers in prison for killing a poor black man.
To the people of Baltimore and the demonstrators across America, I heard your call for no justice.
The city that went from riots on Monday to celebrations by Friday.
This is what democracy looks like.
Is today patting itself on the back for standing up to what many see of police brutality.
For the naysayers who say, what is marching going to do? Marching got us to this point.
The 6 officers, 3 white and 3 black, accused of loading Freddie Gray, cuffed and shackled, face down into a police van, leading to his death following an illegal arrest, are free on bail and will appear in court on May 27th. Their police union says they did no wrong and accused the state's attorney of a political prosecution designed to quell the unrest rather than seek justice.
We are disappointed in the apparent rush to judgment, given the fact the investigation into this matter has not been concluded.
The union wants a special prosecutor appointed, but Mosby says she's from a police family. Both parents were on the force, and she told me her office will not give up the case.
My job as the prosecutor is to follow and uphold the law, and that means equally applying justice to those with or without a badge.
There's another protest scheduled for this afternoon. Baltimore authorities are reluctant to lift the curfew until they're absolutely sure the city is safe and secure. Until then, the National Guard will remain on post and the state of emergency remains in effect. George?
Now, you notice that report kind of began and ended with the question of mob violence and rioting, which that was the main comment I had on this story on the show last week, was how Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation was focusing on the violence. And I guess the violence did bring a lot more media attention as it developed over the week. But I also thought that ABC report was fairly even-handed in terms of the charges from the state's prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, and then the police union response, and it sort of laid out somewhat what the charges were. And then as sort of a follow-up to that, George Stephanopoulos had on Representative Elijah Cummings, a member of Congress from that area in Maryland, and asked him specifically about whether there was a rush to judgment, which was the charge from the police union, and that also led to a response where at least someone was able to give some confidence in the charges, as opposed to what I'll show you from Fox News a little later. But anyway, here's how that this is sort of a follow-up from ABC this morning here.
Officers are vowing to fight the charges. We just saw the head of the police union call it a rush to judgment. Are you confident these charges are going to lead to convictions, and will we see new unrest if they don't?
Well, I don't know. I feel very comfortable with regard to what Ms. Mosley has done. She is a veteran prosecutor. She's a young lady who has spent a lot of time addressing these kinds of issues. And her integrity is impeccable, without a doubt. And I think she made the very best decision that she could. She looked at all the evidence and did what she had to do.
What has to happen in the
Now, I showed that specifically because you're going to see later there are several attacks on the state's prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, especially from Fox News, although I won't show all the Fox News attacks I've seen over the week. I have considered making a video, an edited, produced video about that. If you think that's a good idea, you can let me know, because I hopefully have some time at the beginning of this week to try to do that based on the reaction to the charges on Friday. But moving on with the comparison of the network overviews, next I want to show you how CBS covered it. Another fairly even-handed report laying out the charges with a couple little problems that I'll talk about after you see that. This is a CBS reporter, Wyatt Andrews. Let me make sure I got that right. Yeah, Wyatt Andrews giving the background report from Baltimore over here.
Good morning, Bob. Related to the demonstrations here in Baltimore last night, there was a much different attitude yesterday, especially compared to the violence that we saw on Monday night. The difference in that mood came directly from the charges that were filed against the police on Friday, the 6 officers involved in the arrest of Freddie Gray.
Thousands of people marched on Saturday, first assembling around City Hall, then occupying an intersection in northwest Baltimore close to Freddie Gray's home. Plenty of anger was expressed, but there was also celebration due to Friday's arrest of 6 police officers on charges that range from assault to second-degree murder. In a community not used to the arrest of police, Christine Forbes of Baltimore said it's about time.
A lot of times they don't be held accountable for their actions, so it was a kind of surprise, but if justice was served, I believe it was served.
I heard your call for no justice, no peace.
When Baltimore's top prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, announced that criminal charges were being filed, the reaction on the street was unreserved joy. But reaction from legal experts has been more critical. Defense attorneys familiar with the charges say Mosby faces an uphill climb in court.
I don't believe she has a slam dunk path to a conviction.
Ben Herbst, a Baltimore defense attorney, says the toughest case to prove is against Caesar Goodson, the officer driving the van when Gray was fatally injured. Goodson was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder, a charge that requires the state to show that Goodson injured Gray on purpose.
Do we know that the officer made extra actions that showed a depraved heart? I don't believe we do at this point.
Extra actions like slamming on the brakes?
Yes.
Still, the fact that charges were filed at all drained some of the anger from the streets. Baltimore's police commissioner is Anthony Batts.
And now we'll have the confidence that the truth will come out and the truth will overcome for all.
The violence may be over, but Baltimore will likely remain on edge as these charges and these officers head toward trial. And now Freddie Gray, the man who simply ran from the police on the morning of his arrest, becomes the newest symbol in the national conversation about unequal justice. Bob?
So, yeah, that was Wyatt Andrews from CBS, and I thought that was an okay report. The only real clip they showed of the press conference that Marilyn Mosby held on Friday laying out the charges was this part where she said, "I heard your call, no justice, no peace." And that's actually something I'm going to fault Fox News for when I get to that clip in a few more clips. And then the other problem that I saw there was the way he described this second-degree depraved heart murder, the worst charge against the driver of the van in which the injury occurred to Freddie Gray. He showed that defense attorney talking about how it would be an uphill fight, and that's definitely true. It's definitely difficult to convict police officers, and for that charge there'll have to be extra evidence that he acted recklessly. But in the report there, you saw the reporter claim that they have to show he did it on purpose, and that it's an unintentional murder. The second degree depraved heart murder in Maryland, I did some research on this, there's actually a specific Maryland case that says it's one of the unintentional murders, and it says it's very much like gross negligence manslaughter with like reckless disregard, and it's just a little bit more reckless disregard. And I apologize for the chain sound. That's my dog shaking for some reason. But anyway, I wanted to explain that problem with the CBS clip, even though in general it was a fairly even-handed look at the charges. I mean, compared to what I'll show from Fox News in a minute. But before I get to that, I want to show NBC and then sort of this quick clip from CNN. But first, here's how Chuck Todd did an overview of what has happened in Baltimore in the last week over in this clip.
Her city became the focus of global attention. From protests and violence to celebration in a city still under curfew and patrolled by the National Guard.
We have probable cause to file criminal charges. Yes! Yes! The manner of death deemed a homicide by the Maryland State Medical Examiner.
6 police officers, 3 white and 3 black, were charged Friday in the death of Freddie Gray. State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby accuses the officers of arresting Gray illegally, ignoring his pleas for medical help, and failing to put a seatbelt on him.
Mr. Gray suffered a severe and critical neck injury as a result of being handcuffed, shackled by his feet, and unrestrained inside of the BPD wagon.
The charges against the officers run the gamut, from assault to false imprisonment, involuntary manslaughter to second-degree murder. All of the officers have been released on bail.
There will be justice for Mr. Gray, there will be justice for his family, and there will be justice for the people of Baltimore.
The police union is defending the officers for now and demanding that a special prosecutor take over the case.
We believe that these officers will be vindicated as they have done nothing wrong.
I'm joined now by the...
So yeah, that was the overview from NBC's Meet the Press from Chuck Todd, and I thought it was a fairly good overview. They showed more extended clips from the charging of the officers, the press conference from Marilyn Mosby. They did a good job of talking about what the basis of the charges were, especially saying that he was handcuffed and shackled and put like face down in the van, and that's what caused his severed spine. That's really the key to this whole case. Well, excuse me, one of a couple keys. One key to the case is the fact that he was illegally arrested, so that means that there's false imprisonment, and I I've just seen the charges. I haven't seen the basis of the charges, but I don't know if there's some sort of a felony murder, or even there's something called misdemeanor manslaughter, where if you're already committing a crime and someone dies during that crime, then it can be murder or manslaughter, even though you didn't actually try to kill someone or meet the other elements of that crime. But I don't know if that applies in this case. But the fact that they didn't put a seatbelt on him and put him face down so that he was like sliding around in the floor of that van, and that's basically how his head like went right into some part of that van, and that's how he got his spine injury, apparently. At least that's what the prosecution's going to claim. I mean, that was really emphasized in that NBC report. Now, moving over to the CNN overview, they didn't really do an overview on CNN State of the Union because it was sort of this continuing live coverage, and there were two different versions broadcast at 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. in California time. So I don't really have an overview from CNN, but they did give sort of a bipartisan look at reactions to what was going on in Baltimore, showing several presidential candidates, mostly Republican, but a couple Democrat. There's Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley in this montage that also includes Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush, who focuses on this mom who went and like slapped around her kid when she saw him on TV, that you saw, I think, in one of those previous stories. But anyway, here's reaction of presidential candidates from CNN this morning over here.
It's sad. It's scary. I came to the train on Baltimore last night. I'm glad the train didn't stop.
I think my mom and that the woman who was bringing her child back home have a lot in common, which I admired her a lot for doing what she did.
It's such a wonderful example of parental responsibility.
The real issue here is about policing. It is about policing the police, and it is about the state of justice and injustice in the United States of America.
These recent tragedies should galvanize us to come together as a nation to find our balance again.
President Obama, when he was elected, he could have been a unifying figure. He's made decisions that I think have inflamed racial tensions.
Ted Cruz blames racial tensions on President Obama because there weren't any racial tensions before we elected a black president, and it was our black president that I can't even think of anything President Obama's done to inflame racial tensions. He's really tried to do everything to like not look like an angry black man, as far as I can remember. But I mean, I guess he did say that if he had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin. Maybe that's about as far as I think he's ever gone. But and he had a press conference with the Japanese Prime Minister that I watched this last week, where he gave like this whole long 6-point response to what was going on in Baltimore, and pretty much everything in there seemed pretty reasonable and was not flaming racial tensions. And you know, he did talk, you know, he didn't comment on ongoing investigations, and he talked about, you know, the importance of police. And anyway, I don't have any clips from that, but I did want to move on to the Fox News coverage of this Baltimore story. So in the overview of what's happening in Baltimore on Fox News Sunday this morning, from their reporter Doug McKelway, there are no clips of Marilyn Mosby's charging of the officers. They don't even really talk about the basis of the charges, what they did that injured and eventually killed Freddie Gray. But they do have a clip from the police union spokesperson talking about how, you know, the rush to judgment and how they didn't do anything wrong. And then there's this weird little additional news item added at the end about how a cop was shot in New York last night, which, you know, that is news, but it seems to be not the kind of news that would go on a national news program talking about, you know, these national stories, unless you really want to try to spin it a certain way, which of course Fox News does, as you can see over in this clip.
Hi, Chris. It was another quiet night in Baltimore as that 10 p.m. curfew took effect. The combination of that 10 p.m. curfew in conjunction with more aggressive policing and also the charging of those 6 police officers has brought a greater sense of calm to the city of Baltimore, with only 20 arrests as of 11 p.m. last night. So calm that Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake today lifted the curfew. Still in a rally here at City Hall yesterday, we heard some provocative rhetoric. One speaker invoking the words of Winston Churchill, "We'll fight on the beaches and the hills, in the cities we shall never surrender." Another speaker cited the case of Alan Bullock, an 18-year-old who was photographed in the Baltimore Sun smashing in a police car window with a traffic cone. His parents, after seeing that picture, urged their son to turn himself in. He did just that. But he's now facing a $500,000 bail and the potential of 8 years in jail. That while other arrested riders were merely set free.
We cannot allow them to tear democracy up in our face while we pay for it. When is a man's life worth less than a damn car window? A car window. And he turned himself in.
The 6 police officers charged in Freddie Gray's death have all been released on bonds ranging from $250,000 to $350,000. All that while many in the law enforcement community say this was a rush to judgment.
In my 20 years career as a law enforcement officer and 16 years as an attorney, I have never seen such a hurried rush to file criminal charges, which I believe are driven by forces which are separate and apart from the application of law and the facts of this case as we know them.
Separately, last night, a New York City police officer was shot in the head as he chased down an armed suspect. That officer is hospitalized now in an induced coma. Here in Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan is calling for a day of prayer and peace. Chris, this is a city that badly needs that.
So what do you think? Was that like a lot more biased, a lot more one-sided than the other news reports that I showed you? I think they didn't show anything from Marilyn Mosby, and they showed that clip from the police union spokesperson. They didn't talk about the substance of the charges. I mean, I think it was much more biased compared to any of those other clips from the other 4 corporate news media outlets. And then right after showing that story, they had on a Democrat for once. They're actually, well, I don't know if the attorney for the family of Michael Gray, Billy Murphy, if he's a Democrat, but they did have Democrat Donna Edwards on. She's a representative from Maryland who is going to be running for Senate for the seat that Barbara Mikulski's retiring from. And so when they had on Donna Edwards, they did show a clip from Marilyn Mosby's press conference, but nothing about the charges, something that they have been harping on Fox News since Friday, that shows her bias and how she did this all politically, because she said that she was going to seek justice for the victim, which I never heard them complain about that on Fox News before, but you can see them complain about it in this question from Chris Wallace to Donna Edwards right over here.
Yeah. Let's start with State's Attorney Mosby's remarks as she charged those 6 police officers in this case.
To the people of Baltimore and the demonstrators across America, I heard your call for no justice, no peace. Your peace is sincerely needed as I work to deliver justice on behalf of this young man.
Congresswoman, is that too political for a prosecutor? Rather than seek justice for the demonstrators or Freddie Gray, shouldn't she just be seeking justice, period?
No, what she was saying is that she really wanted the process to begin and for people to understand what that is, so that the city and all of our cities could be at peace and in calm. I think that she did an amazing job in laying out the reasons for a probable cause finding. This is the beginning of the process, not the end of it.
All right. People...
Well, at least they let someone respond to this claim that I've heard over and over again on Fox News. It's one of a couple ways they've attacked this state's prosecutor, who I found the press conference kind of impressive. And I'm not usually impressed with prosecutors, having been a criminal defense attorney and a public defender. But in case you missed that Fox News charge I have an itchy dog next to me. If you're wondering what that ringing noise is, that's my dog scratching. I apologize for that. But here is Chris Wallace making sure that when he started his panel discussion that no viewers missed this point that Marilyn Mosby was being too political and was raising eyebrows over here.
To the youth of this city, I will seek justice on your behalf. This is a moment. This is your moment.
Baltimore State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby raising some eyebrows with comments she made after announcing criminal charges against 6 police officers in the death of Freddie Gray. And it's time now for our Sunday group, Fox News.
And Britt Hume, who I just showed at the very end there, he spent 90 seconds, 2 minutes in a clip that I can't even stand to show, talking about how political this whole thing was. Someone finally at the end did point out that this is an elected position that's supposed to respond to the will of the people to some extent at least, and that then I saw someone pointing out on another show that she actually ran on a platform of giving of police accountability and the problems in the police department. So she is following through on that. I hope that she has the evidence to back up the charges. Even if they are overcharged, the police officers, I have to say that that is standard practice for prosecutors. They often will try to charge the most that they think that the facts will allow, especially when there's some ongoing investigation. And if the second-degree murder charge has to be dropped and it's just down to manslaughter, I guess that's something that they're willing to have happen. But overall, I thought she did a good job. And I want to show one more clip here. This is from CNN's Michael Smerconish on State of the Union, talking to the family attorney for the family of Freddie Gray. His name is Billy Murphy, and asking about. He shows also a clip of Marilyn Mosby and asks if he was stunned like everyone else. A little bit like what happened on Fox News, but certainly not as bad. Let me make sure I get that. Oh yeah, over in this clip.
Mr. Gray's death was a homicide. We have probable cause to file criminal charges. Second-degree depraved heart murder. No one is above the law.
Swift, decisive, and nothing short of remarkable. State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby charging 6 Baltimore City cops in the death of Freddie Gray. Yet critics question if Mosby's move was more about cooling tempers than evidence. Attorney for the Gray family, joining me right now, Billy Murphy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Midweek last week, you were trying to lessen expectations. Among many others, you were saying, Friday, don't expect it to be a big day. And yet, here's the Saturday morning newspaper. How floored were you when she descended the stairs right over there and announced those charges?
I was stunned. I know that they had been working feverishly around the clock. And that it had been a very closed circuit where we couldn't get any information about the progress of the investigation any more than anybody else could. And to see it happen and play out this quickly was both stunning and gratifying.
FOP.
So, yeah, that is the first question that CNN's Michael Smerconish asked of Billy Murphy, the attorney for the family of Freddie Gray. And Freddie Gray was only on 2 programs. He was on CNN State of the Union, and he was actually also on Fox News Sunday. And I'm going to show one clip from that. But the next clip I'm going to show is from the CNN State of the Union interview, where they asked Billy Murphy a question they also asked on Fox News. And I'm not going to repeat the question and answer from Fox News. But this is a charge I've also heard on Fox News over and over again. That and this came from the police union, the charge that State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby is biased and should recuse herself and appoint a special prosecutor because she took a contribution from this attorney, Billy Murphy. And you can see how Billy Murphy responds to that. It's actually not even true. It didn't come from him. And, well, you can see his answer over in this clip.
FOP says you gave her $5,000. They also say you were on her transition committee and therefore she should recuse herself. Your response is what?
They gave her $3,000 and I didn't give her any money. My son gave her money. And so they got it completely wrong. Now, what should the conflict be with them? I mean, this is politics. If you spend money so that you can get the right person in office, isn't that the American way?
Well, I don't know if that's the American way, that to spend the money to get the right person in office. I think you're supposed to vote to get the right person in office. That's the American way, but that has to do with campaign finance reform that I'm not going to talk about this week. But I actually want to show a clip from Marilyn Mosby herself, not from her press conference, but she did this interview with Chris Hayes on the MSNBC show All In with Chris Hayes on Friday. I put a link down in the video description to the entire interview, but here's the clip where she responds to that charge about the conflict of interest from the contribution, giving sort of the same answer that Billy Murphy gave over here.
You asked me about the conflict of interest with reference to the family attorney. There is no conflict of interest. The family, Mr. Gray's family attorney donated to my campaign and supported me. I had over 700 people who donated to my campaign, including the FOP. So I don't see how there's any sort of conflict of interest with reference to that.
So, I mean, I think that makes sense to the extent that prosecutors are taking contributions to their campaign. I mean, there is some conflict of interest, but it's certainly no greater than all the times the prosecutors take contributions from the police, which is what they usually do, and what she herself got a $3,000 contribution from the police and a $5,000 contribution from the son of Billy Murphy, who apparently is one of the top attorneys in Baltimore. That's why he has this case, and so it's not that unusual for him to also contribute to the campaign of the winning candidate for state's attorney. At least I don't think so. And then I also want to show another clip from Billy Murphy responding to this charge that you also hear on Fox News, but this is also on CNN State of the Union, about whether, when she said that she heard the cry of, no justice, no peace, if that was too political. This is Michael Smerconish asking that question, and the response he gets first talks about the history and then has this slam on former Baltimore Mayor Martin O'Malley, who may be running against Hillary Clinton. And I'm going to show some clips from Martin O'Malley in a minute, so pay attention to that part. And then he goes into this whole thing about broken windows also that's important. It's a very extended clip. I hope you enjoy it here.
When she descended those stairs and she said, and the words I think were, "To the people of Baltimore, I have heard your call of no justice, no peace." Does that not sound like she's responding to the public cry rather than to the evidence?
No, it sounds like that she's trying to reassure people that in her administration, the system is going to work. Remember, in other administrations, the system didn't work. Police prosecutions were almost non-existent. They were cover-ups that were generally believed by the top brass and covered over by a less than thorough investigation by the police of themselves. This was the routine practice. However, we knew from the number of settlements and verdicts and judgments that were going against the city, including one that I got for $44 million, where a guy who got thrown headfirst into a brick wall by a police officer and was a paraplegic, that there was a serious problem in Baltimore. The whole community knew it. And during one person's administration, there were all these street sweeping operations, and people were arrested for
nothing. Who are we talking about?
Then Mayor Martin O'Malley.
President Martin O'Malley, or so perhaps he thinks in the future.
He's got to live with that. I mean, and this makes that relevant conduct.
Counsel, let me just be clear about what you're saying. You're saying that Martin O'Malley, as mayor of this town, he took law enforcement too far. He had too much of a zero tolerance policy.
We told him that at the time. I came out against his governorship and supported Ehrlich because of that. This was a street sweeping operation like none other. I spoke to him privately about it. I said, "Martin, why are you doing this? You got to stop. I'm going to break with you if you don't stop."
This gets into the conversation I was just having with the police chiefs about broken windows and whether that needs to be rethought. You've got Bill Bratton in New York City this week saying, hey, if I don't enforce the lower stuff becomes the big stuff. They become violent criminals, and that's why we're in this position.
That is such an improper calculus. a window breaker becomes a major criminal? No. Most of the crime in this city and every other city is done by repeat offenders who are career criminals, who have committed many, many, many offenses. And they make the regular citizenry look like angels in comparison.
What Bratton will...
So yeah, there were a lot of really good things in that response from the attorney for the family of Freddie Gray, Billy Murphy there. And at first I thought he gave a good response to the question about whether calling for justice is something that is too political or too biased from a state's attorney or a prosecutor, which I think is kind of silly the way that's been played up on Fox News. And then what he said about Martin O'Malley, I think, is an important point, that some of this whole racist criminal justice system, what you see here in the new Jim Crow and by Michelle Alexander and then Matt Taibbi's book The Divide that are over my left shoulder here, a lot of that problem isn't just from Republicans. It comes from the Clinton administration's crime bill, Martin O'Malley's zero tolerance type policing, and he wasn't the only Democrat to do that. And Hillary Clinton is now basically coming, I showed a clip of Hillary Clinton earlier, adopting some of the mass incarceration stuff, rhetoric, where she's basically coming out against Bill Clinton's crime bill when she does that. And I'm going to show one more clip now of Billy Murphy from Fox News Sunday, where Fox News brought up another point, or Chris Wallace from Fox News Sunday brought up a point I've heard on Fox News repeatedly about how there's going to be pressure of more rioting if there happen to be acquittals, because a lot of police officers do end up getting acquitted. First, Billy Murphy doesn't really fall into the trap by demanding any particular verdict, but then he won't speculate about what would happen. And then he actually gets into this long thing about the problem with the war on drugs, which I wasn't really any question Chris Wallace asked him, so it's kind of fortuitous he got to plug that in. And this is kind of another extended answer, or another extended clip that I hope you enjoy over here.
When she descended those stairs and she said, and the words I think...
Oops, I guess it wouldn't be one of my shows if I didn't misplay one clip. So I'm sorry, that is over here.
We have seen a number of cases where police officers are charged, and then when it gets before a jury, they are reluctant and sometimes refuse to convict police officers. Are you and Freddie Gray's family willing to say that you will accept the verdict of a jury of 12 peers, regardless of what it is?
We've been saying that repeatedly. We haven't asked for a particular verdict. We have said that we want justice. And whatever justice is will be determined by a jury of 12 people selected from this community who have indicated to the satisfaction of the presiding judge that they can be fair and impartial in this case. We can do that in Baltimore just like it's been done all over the country.
And what if the verdict comes down and all those 6 officers are found not guilty?
I'm not going to speculate about anything because it doesn't do any good. We have a process. That process is going to be handled fairly and impartially, just like every other case in Baltimore is normally handled. I have confidence in our judiciary that it can be handled right here and in the proper way.
Last question. Some people, because they're not taking quite the reserved position you are, as you well know, some people on the street in Baltimore are saying, look, if these 6 officers aren't all convicted, that the rioting in Baltimore will be even worse than it was this week. Is that the way the criminal justice system is supposed to work, sir?
Well, you're not talking about the criminal justice system when you're talking about one day of rioting and a week full of tension in anticipation, incorrectly, that there would be more rioting. And we don't like it in Baltimore when you say there's been a week of rioting. And number 2, the problem is a very deep problem. It can't be satisfied about labels or by labels of left and right. These are children who have been neglected. They don't have parents because mainly the war on drugs is a war on black people who are suspected of having drugs, and whites in this town, just like in major cities across the country, who have the same amount of illegal drugs, except they use them discreetly, don't get prosecuted. They're about 91, 92% of the cases in Baltimore City, probably more, where only blacks and browns are prosecuted for drugs. That has to be addressed, and we have to end this terrible war on drugs, which has never been successful, and which does nothing but create over-incarceration of black men who could be fathers, and it destroys black families in so many ways. So you are right to point out in some ways that money is not the answer. Part of the answer is that we have to create a city where kids get raised properly, and when they are neglected, that we take care of that problem because they're just kids.
I don't know. I think Chris Wallace may have gotten more than he bargained for in that answer, and there's a lot of good stuff in there about how the war on drugs has created this war on black men especially, and that's what's talked about in the new Jim Crow especially, and the class aspect of it is talked about a little more in The Divide. You know, one of the interesting things about the book The Divide here by Matt Taibbi is there's this whole section where they talk about these vans going around, not Baltimore, but I believe it was New York City, and picking up these people for basically no reason because there's no accountability. The charges will either get dismissed or pled down to just a fine, and so these people on the street get picked up for these charges like blocking a doorway or blocking the sidewalk for like standing in, right in front of where they live, and that people like Freddie Gray, who got picked up all the time, and I guess he had a bunch of drug possession charges. And anyway, having shown that clip of Chris Wallace harping on the attorney for the family of Freddie Gray about the possible ramifications of the difficult case to prove against police officers, I want to show a couple jokes from Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live last night. The first one had that as the premise over in this clip.
The state's attorney in Baltimore announced Friday that charges would be filed against 6 police officers in the death of Freddie Gray. It's a vital and important first step on the path to those officers probably being acquitted. A state of emergency was declared in Baltimore after protests turned violent and would turn into violent rioting, but no deaths were reported, meaning the riots were still far less dangerous than the backseat of a Baltimore police van.
And that's definitely true. When they talk about the violence from the rioting, they don't talk about the violence that started the rioting, and that's part of the context that I did not see a lot in the corporate media, especially on Fox News. Although I do want to show one more clip from Fox News Sunday that is kind of surprising, where someone got to talk about something that you don't hear a lot about on Fox News, which is one thing that Fox News Sunday sometimes does. This is again a clip from Representative Donna Edwards, the Democrat from Maryland who is running for Senate. She's now from the House of Representatives, and she talks about over-policing, which is what some people like to call this broken window strategy you heard Billy Murphy talking about before, where any, or the zero tolerance, which is the zero tolerance policy of Martin O'Malley. Well, here's Donna Edwards talking about over-policing, and Chris Wallace doesn't even seem to know what that is and asks her to define it. Maybe he knows what it is, but anyway, he lets her define it, which I'm glad to see on Fox News, at least over in this clip.
Look now, but I would say that there's an policing that's going on, not just in Baltimore, but really across this country, and it's something that we have to evaluate as a matter of public policy.
What does over-policing mean?
Well, what it means is that, if you have communities where the only face of government that they see is law enforcement, it's not investment in their schools, it's not investment in their communities and economic development, it's law enforcement, and that's not the fault of police, that's the fault of policymakers who are making decisions about where our priorities are.
Okay, well, let's...
So, yeah, like I said, that's something you don't hear a lot on Fox News, and the whole problem of over-policing is especially talked about, like I said, in the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I don't know if over-policing so much, but just disparate policing between the poor and the very rich is the premise of Matt Taibbi's The Divide. There are those two books that are on my bookshelf behind me there that I also talk about extensively in this video that I have a link down to in the video description that if you're interested and you haven't watched, you should check that out. But now we're going to move over on to a different program, CBS's Face the Nation, where I thought Bob Schieffer had kind of a weird take on this, where he was asking if only whites can police whites and only blacks can police blacks, and when he was talking to Cornell William Brooks, the head of the NAACP, and I think Cornell William Brooks had a good answer that, it doesn't really matter. Any race can implement a racist system. And that's also, again, another point that Michelle Alexander makes in her book, The New Jim Crow, that black police officers can be part of a racist criminal justice system. And I think that's the right answer to a weird question from Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation this morning.
You were in Ferguson as well. There's
Yes.
a very different situation in Baltimore. You have a black mayor, you have a black police chief. 3 of the officers who were charged were African Americans. What I'm wondering, are we at the point in America where we have to have black officials to deal with black people and white officials to deal with white people? It seems to me there's still a great divide here.
Certainly there's a great divide, but we need to be clear here. Racial profiling does not require that all the participants be white or black or anything else. The fact of the matter is this process of profiling communities and people has a disproportionate effect on African Americans. Freddie Gray was a young man who was detained, who was arrested, where there was no probable cause. We live in a country where African American young men are 25 times more likely to lose their lives at the hands of the police than their white counterparts. So the fact that the mayor is black and some of the defendants are black doesn't speak to the fact that we have a young man who had his vertebrae crushed, his spinal cord severed, and who's dead. And so the point being here is we have to focus on how do we change this modality and model of policing that is badly broken and ineffective. Racial profiling doesn't work.
So we start with racial profiling.
We start with the fact that we have a form of policing where people are suspected of minor offenses, subjected to overwhelmingly major uses of force, often lethal. And so that's what we have to focus on here. There's a federal Racial Profiling Act which has been introduced in the Senate and the House, which goes back to President George Bush and Attorney General John Ashcroft. It needs to move. And we're calling on the President and a bipartisan coalition in Congress to move on it. We need to end this practice because it's harming and hurting, brutalizing communities.
So I thought that was one of several good comments on the Sunday morning shows that took what was happening in Baltimore and brought it into this broader context, that I'm talking about, from the new Jim Crow and the divide that I talked about in my video about the racist, classist criminal justice system. And that was also what Donna Edwards was talking about in terms of over-policing, and Billy Murphy was talking about in terms of the war on drugs. And actually over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, they had a report from their justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, that attempted to take what was happening in Baltimore and put it in this larger context, and in the context of all these other incidents around the country. And I wanted to show that report over in this clip.
The searing images. Ferguson. A 12-year-old boy shot and killed by police in Cleveland. Eric Garner's death in Staten Island. And that fatal police shooting of Walter Scott in South Carolina. And now Baltimore. A steady stream of events stoking a growing national movement, an intense debate about race and policing. With each case, the intensity grows, and the unsettling truth is that a toxic cocktail of factors that led to unrest in Baltimore exists in cities across the country.
No racist police!
High unemployment, high poverty, high rates of crime and incarceration, and deep-seated mistrust between minorities and the police that serve them. What it means is that all it takes is one controversial encounter between a police officer and an African-American male to spark a firestorm of emotion and accusations.
I think it's a seminal moment in policing. I think we're seeing a paradigm shift. It's going to take a long time for us to rebuild from the distrust that's going on right now.
People are thinking that's what we do right away, reach for our guns and start shooting people, when that's not the fact at all.
The citizens are focusing too much on the negative, which is a very, very small minority. Every day, there's millions of encounters between police and citizens that go very well.
We spent time with officers in Washington, 40 miles from Baltimore. They say some of the issues between minorities and police run deep.
The police department is getting blamed for the historic lens through which black people view government in general, police in particular.
And today, so often most aggressive in high-crime neighborhoods, the mistrust builds.
They're not seeing us as normal human beings and are just like them, but have a really tough job to do.
Right now, authorities say that better technology, including expanded use of body cameras by police and improved training of law enforcement on use of force, are keys to reducing encounters that end badly.
On both sides, we need to listen to each other.
Get out of the car, interact with the citizens, let them interact with you.
So I thought that was a pretty good context overview from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, reporter Pierre Thomas. And then they also had on a Republican, the only African-American Republican senator, Tim Scott. And George Stephanopoulos asked him whether this was a national issue and got some of the, the main solution that you saw in that report from Pierre Thomas was just body cameras. That's the one thing that everyone seems to agree on, and you hear that from Tim Scott as an example of how there can be federal resources to do things like that, but not any sort of oversight. He didn't seem to think, but you can see his answer, which seems more reasonable than many Republicans, and I'll show some more Republicans a little later, but here's Tim Scott talking to George Stephanopoulos here.
You all very much. I want to go now to Congressman Tim Scott of South Carolina, Republican of South Carolina. Thank you for joining us this morning, Senator. And, your own state has been rocked by the shooting of Walter Scott last month. Is it time now for a national response to these issues?
I certainly think that law enforcement is a local issue, but the question is, can we weigh in from the national level and provide some resources? I think body cameras lead us in the right direction. I say that because, according to at least one study, a 90% drop in complaints against police officers and a 60% drop in the use of force. I think it helps the officer do their jobs better and keeps the officer safe, and at the same time helps to keep the community safe as well. So I think a part of the national opportunity for us to provide resources is there. I would be very careful for the federal level to start figuring out how to have a local police.
So, of course, even President Obama in his press conference this week said that he can't, federalize the police and tell them how to do stuff. He can just give oversight and resources, kind of like what Senator Tim Scott's answer there, which I thought was mildly in the right direction, but not really talking about things the way you want to hear the issues addressed, or the way I want to hear the issues addressed, and the way that I heard them addressed from the head lawyer for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill, over on CBS's Face of the Nation this morning, talking to Bob Schieffer, where he gave her a really open-ended question, what happened in Baltimore, and got a really comprehensive answer, I thought, here.
Sherilyn, let me start with you. You've lived in Baltimore for 15 years. What happened?
Well, I think you're starting to see the results of what many people have been talking about and working on in Baltimore City for a long time. One piece of it is, without question, the issue of police violence and engagement with young African-American men. It's one of the reasons why I think what we do need now is for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to engage in a pattern and practice investigation of policing in Baltimore City. Without question, that's a real problem. But what we also see is the results of this long-standing segregation in the city of Baltimore. In 2005, when a federal district judge responded to a suit that many civil rights organizations brought about public housing, segregated public housing in Baltimore, he said that HUD had maintained public housing in Baltimore as an island reservation where the poor were just deposited. So what we're seeing when we look at those pictures on the camera, when we look at those neighborhoods, we're looking at the results of this enforced segregation. We're looking at the CVS, of course, but nobody's asking, are there any supermarkets in that community? Why is this a food desert? We're looking at Toya Graham engaged with her son and talking about trying to raise her 6 children, but no one's asking about the failed transportation system in Baltimore that makes it difficult for mothers like her, even when there are jobs, to be able to get to those jobs. So infrastructure, I heard Congressman Ryan, talk about what we could do and what the federal government can't do. What the federal government can do is exactly what it did when it decided it wanted to support white people and lift them out of poverty. It was infrastructure. It was federal housing loans. It was all of the apparatus of the federal government: transportation, housing, education.
So like I said, I thought that was a really good comprehensive answer from a really broad question that Bob Schieffer asked. And I also want to show something that Bob Schieffer did that I thought was not so great, and but has been replicated a lot across the media, and a lot of people seem to like this mom who went out and hit her kid. What's her name? You heard Sherilyn Ifill mention her briefly there. Her name is Tanya Graham, I think. I may have that a little bit off, but Bob Schieffer brought her up and sort of like claimed he really liked her. Later, I think in a clip I'm not going to get to, he talked about how his mom used to do that to him. He reminded him of his... No, I think he does mention how she reminds him of his mom, so maybe that explains it. But a lot of people in the media seem to latch on to this mom, and Sherilyn Ifill gave sort of a broader context that makes it, while not all that laudable, more a symptom of a big problem. And there's also a response from Julianne Malveaux over in this clip.
I want to talk about Toya Graham. This is that mom who went out there and saw her kid, and here you see him, and she said, "You get over here." And she took him out of that picture. And I've got to say, I know it's even our staff here in Washington, some people think that was remarkable. Some say, well, you oughtn't to be beating your children in public. But I've got to say, I thought my mother had come back. I mean, I don't believe in reincarnation, but Momo, as we called her,
well,
I thought she was back.
If Tavis were on right now, he might talk about how black moms would say, "I brought you in this world and I can take you out." And that was certainly an example of that. But Stacey Patton had a really great piece in the Washington Post this morning that talked about essentially beating. I mean, this beating young people goes back to enslavement. And so while I think LaToya was absolutely right to, basically chastise her son, this was a public humiliation of a young black man, and it was excessive force.
But the reason for it is fear, and that's what we should be paying attention to. Toya Graham is a mom living in fear. She's in fear of losing her son to the streets. In that particular circumstance where he said she didn't want me to become another Freddie Gray, she's in fear that the police will retaliate against him in a way that will kill him. So we should be asking the question, why should a mom like Toya Graham be living in that level of fear? That's what's motivating her response.
Oops, sorry about that delay. I thought that was a good response pretty much to Bob Schieffer's over fondness for this woman who was beating her kid. I mean, I don't think she should be charged with child abuse, but it's not really a method of discipline that I approve of, and I think there is sort of a context, the context of slavery, and I've read several good articles over the week about how basically in areas where there's this police violence against young black men, their families have to over-discipline them so that they don't get killed by the police, basically, or that's kind of what you heard over there. And next I want to show a couple context clips from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, mostly from Bill Maher himself and D.L. Hughley, who I've generally been a fan of, and I like what he said on the show on Friday. This starts off with Bill Maher comparing cops thinking they're infallible to the Catholic Church's infallibility, and then there's this D.L. Hughley clip that I like that I'll talk about after you see the whole thing over here.
That, because I've mentioned this before on the show. I don't understand why the police are infallible. They remind me a lot of the Catholic Church. In fact, well, they do. Here's the stat. They they were sued, the Baltimore police. Right. I think 317 suits. They paid out $5.7 million since 2011. Right. This does remind me of the Catholic Church. And in the Catholic Church, of course, not every priest was a pedophile, but the institution covered up for the pedophiles. And this is what I see. The head of the police union said today, "I have never seen such a hurried rush to file criminal charges." Well, it wasn't hurried. Right. This happened over a week ago. Yeah. No one condones police misconduct. Well, yes, they do. Of all the officers involved at all times acted reasonably and in accordance with their training, well, then their training sucks, and how would you know that? Yeah. No officer injured Mr. Gray. These officers did nothing wrong. They're infallible. The police are infallible in America.
Is they didn't put this man's seatbelt on. Now, they have this commercial, click it or ticket. So in other words, if I don't have a seatbelt on, I'm going to get a ticket. And they didn't put one on him. Here's what I will say about what has happened here. If they had just treated Mr. Gray like a human being, when he asked for help, if they had just treated him like a human being, they wouldn't be going to court and he wouldn't be dead. And the only reason that exists in this country is because America, by and large, thinks it's no big deal. And it could not continue otherwise.
And that's a key point from D.L. Hughley at the end there. Like I was saying, that's the racism inherent in the system. It's the new Jim Crow that they're basically, and also in the divide, the key points in there, and the key point I made back in my video, I think, when I talked about this, that I put a link to down in the video description, is that there are certain parts of our society, whether it's racially or by class, that we've deemed disposable, subhuman, not worthy of full rights of a human being, and that is the basis of the over-incarceration, or mass incarceration, over-policing, the drug war, a criminal justice system that doesn't really give due process to a lot of people. It all comes down to not giving people the respect and dignity they deserve as human beings, and I just wanted to emphasize that point, because that is a philosophical, or I guess a human value that is missing in the system. That is one of the keys. And then I want to show another quick clip from that same discussion between Bill Maher and D.L. Hughley, where this is just a pet peeve of mine. A lot of people have said that these officers in Baltimore were indicted, which is something D.L. Hughley said before this clip, and then Bill Maher repeats. There was no grand jury here. As I said in the whole Ferguson case with Bob McCullough, where he took it to the secret grand jury and spun all the evidence the way he wanted so there would be no charges, he didn't even have to go to the grand jury. He could have just charged that officer and brought it to a preliminary hearing before a judge, where the judge would decide in public, based on evidence submitted in public, whether there's probable cause, enough evidence to take it to trial. And that's what this state's prosecutor in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, did. She charged them based on the evidence as she saw it. If you're not in the federal system, there's no right to a grand jury, so the prosecutor can just charge you, and then the judge decides at a preliminary hearing if there's probable cause, enough evidence, and it's all done in public, which is the better way to do it. So there was no indictment in this case, which Bill Maher gets wrong, and then they talk about comparing this to Rodney King in a way that I thought was kind of funny at the end over here.
Yeah, but now These policemen were indicted. Of course, you know, I must say, having lived in L.A. through the riots here, as you probably did too.
Me too.
The police were indicted then too.
Yeah. But
the
after the
shit
second
happened
trial.
after the trial,
Right.
and they got off,
Right.
and that's probably what's going to happen in this one.
No. Well, if we look at it, first there was the trial, then there was a riot, then George Bush Sr. said, "Hey, and federally tried them," to the extent that one of the cops who was convicted, Stacy Coontz, is my limo driver from the airport sometime. Is
that right?
I swear to God, it's the best thing ever. We know what happened. It's the best.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
I didn't realize that Stacy Coon was a limo driver, that former LAPD officer. But after I watched that clip on Friday or Saturday morning when I watched the show on my DVR, I Googled it, and apparently Stacy Coon is a limo driver at Los Angeles International Airport. There was some controversy when he was the limo driver for Al Gore a while back, so that's all perfectly true. So I thought that was amusing, especially since I lived in LA, I lived in this apartment by the Santa Monica Freeway, not far from where there was actual rioting during those riots, so I experienced it. And I even drove through Koreatown the night before when the riots started, not even knowing that the riots were going on there. That was, but anyway, I want to show a couple interesting clips from NBC's Meet the Press that gave a really different perspective on the whole situation than you normally see from the corporate media, and I wanted to give kudos to Meet the Press for doing that. The first one is a clip they did on the word from the street in Baltimore. They just did sort of like a man on the street or woman on the street, person on the street take on what's going on over in this clip.
Before I turn to another former mayor of Baltimore, Martin O'Malley, here's a sample of what some Baltimore residents told us needs to be done to fix the city.
We need to focus on education, because that's why you're seeing as many people, the young black boys on the streets you see today, because they have lack of education, was pretty much charges them to do nothing else but be on the street.
It has been systemically disinvested, so we're going to have to come back to economic development, human development, and community development.
My son is 3 years old. That's all he wanted to watch was the news the other day. He didn't want to watch cartoons, and he's scared of the police now. So what's he supposed to do when he grow up?
Don't feel like nobody in politics has our back. So they do what they do, and look at the tension we got. Baltimore is now the cornerstone for protecting the police brutality.
The politicians, the police officers, the clergy within Baltimore, they can't address the problem because they haven't identified it. You can't identify or find resolve to an issue that you don't know about. So as soon as we can fix communication and get everybody on one accord, then you'll see more progress.
Joined by
So you see Chuck Todd was about to transition to the interview with Martin O'Malley, and the first question he asked Martin O'Malley that I'm going to show after a clip in between is, you saw that guy saying that politicians don't understand what the problem is, although you notice the guy never said what the problem was, and he's going to ask Martin O'Malley what the problem is, and I'll show you that clip in a minute. But before I get to that, I want to show another interesting take on this. Like I said, a view from someone that you don't normally hear from the corporate media or on these Sunday morning shows. A second clip to give NBC's Meet the Press a little bit of kudos for. This is from a guy, a professor and former drug dealer named D. Watkins, as NBC's Chuck Todd explains before giving his take on how police harassment is an everyday problem for a certain segment of our society, like those who live in Baltimore or certain areas of Baltimore over here.
Death of Freddie Gray. But as we've been discussing, the city's problems have deep roots that go back decades. An op-ed for the New York Times this week caught our eye. It was by Baltimore native D. Watkins, a writer, a professor at Baltimore's Coppin State University, and by his own admission, a former drug dealer. Watkins wrote about the toxic relations between Baltimore's police and its African-American residents, so we invited him to put those same thoughts on camera.
Baltimore City police officers are out of control. I can't remember having a positive experience with a police officer, ever. If you're a black person and you're in a black neighborhood that's poor, then they speak to you like you're not a person. It's never like, hey, how's everything? It's, you mother F, why the F are you on the corner? What the F are you doing out here? Police officers see me as an animal or a thing. The cops pull their guns out. They just make everyone lay on the ground, cracking you across the back of your head. The distrust it's not a new thing. It's been going on forever. Everyone I know has been dealing with police brutality. The bulk of police officers in Baltimore don't live in Baltimore. Their first experience with a black person is when they get a license to kill. Everyone should be upset. Everyone knows what's going on. They can see it. We do need peaceful protests, and we do need those clergymen to step up. But, you know, violence brings about a different result, because when they attacked these stores, the people with money started paying attention. Too peaceful doesn't work. The violence doesn't always work. The violence makes it urgent. So how do we take that urgency and move it to a place where we can get it without the violence? Then we can have real change.
So, like I said, again, kudos to NBC and Chuck Todd and Meet the Press for giving voice to someone who you don't hear a lot on the corporate media, talking about everyday police harassment and what it's like to have to endure that in certain areas in the United States. I'm glad I got a chance to show that to you. And I want to show, like I said, the next clip is also, or the next 3 clips are all from NBC's Meet the Press. This is Chuck Todd talking to former mayor of Baltimore, former governor of Maryland, and quite possibly a presidential candidate running against Hillary Clinton, Martin O'Malley. And like I said, the first question he asked was a follow-up to the clip before last I showed you, where that guy on the street said politicians don't understand what the problem is, and they never showed the guy saying what the problem was. But here's Chuck Todd asking Martin O'Malley what the problem is, and getting what sounds kind of like a presidential campaign rhetoric, in my opinion, over in this clip.
So weighing a bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. Governor O'Malley, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be with you.
I want to pick up on that last comment. He said politicians won't have the answers because they can't agree on what the problem is. What do you think the problem is?
Oh, I think the problem is the fact that we have built an economy that's leaving whole parts of Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, so many citizens behind. I mean, a lot of people, I was giving out food there at St. Peter Clavers in the aftermath of this unrest, and there are people in whole parts of our cities who are being totally left behind and disregarded. They are unheard. They are told they are unneeded by this economy. And that extreme poverty breeds conditions for extreme violence. People are frustrated, they're angry, and they feel like people aren't listening.
1999.
Now, what Martin O'Malley said there is true. And it's talked about in the new Jim Crow, especially about how our cities were hollowed out by deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing jobs, and the inability of people who just have a high school diploma to get a job that can support a family. And then, of course, that followed with the war on drugs that took a lot of those working class men of color out of those neighborhoods and put them in prison and made them unemployable. And so he was starting to talk about that in a way. You know, the rhetoric was good. But as I pointed out when Billy Murphy, the lawyer for Freddie Gray's family, talked about it, Martin O'Malley was part of this zero-tolerance war on drugs when he was mayor of Baltimore. And in this next clip, Chuck Todd sort of brings that up, and brings up the fact that he was part of this whole Clinton crime bill war on drugs, and asked if he made any mistakes. And here, I don't really buy his answers. You know, he says we weren't wrong then, we're just more right now, or something like that. That is not really very convincing to me. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. I've been reading your comments. They've been keeping me company, even though I have so many clips. I'm not really going to talk about what's down in the comment section, I don't think. But I think I have about 120 live viewers at this point. Anyway, you can let me know if you think that Martin O'Malley does a good job of apologizing for being a drug warrior and his zero-tolerance policy over here.
1999, Martin O'Malley said this when you were running for mayor: as much as we'd like to think poverty is the cause of crime, crime is also the cause of poverty. And people have been talking about your focus that was on more policing. to deal with the crime issue. You talked about the drug issue back then. Looking back, what would you do differently?
Well, looking back, I mean, the fact of the matter was that in 1999, the main issue that was holding Baltimore back was the fact that we had allowed ourselves to become the most violent, addicted, and abandoned city in America. We had a conversation through a long, hot campaign about not only how to improve policing in Baltimore, but how to improve how we train and police the police. And so we followed through on that pledge. I was elected with 91% of the vote of my neighbors of that majority African-American city. And we greatly improved drug treatment. And thanks to the work that has continued to this day under Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, we have cut crime in half. And this has been a heartbreaking setback for an otherwise remarkable comeback for Baltimore over these last 15 years.
Well, when you look, though, there's this big bipartisan focus now on criminal justice reform.
As there should be.
And it has to do with non-violent criminals, basically people that were arrested, thrown into jail on drug issues. That wasn't the focus in 1999. That wasn't the focus in the 90s when sort of the policing the broken windows thing. That's the part I wonder if we gotten wrong. Did we get it wrong then?
We didn't get it wrong then, but we have yet to get it entirely right. Look, I've spent my whole life on criminal justice issues. My very first job out of law school was as a prosecutor on the West Side, a place now familiar from the images of these last sad several days. In our state, we actually were able to reduce our incarceration rate to 20-year lows. We were able to reduce our recidivism by 15%, and we also at the same time reduce violent crime down to 35-year lows. I signed legislation to decriminalize, in essence, marijuana possession and other minor charges. I signed legislation to restore voting rights. So this is constant work, Chuck. It is not done, but we are getting smarter and better every day at this, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Now, touting his marijuana decriminalization and his restoration of voting rights, I mean, those are both issues that Republican Senator Rand Paul supports, so that's not a big move to the left. And the fact that he bought into certain Republican or war on drug policies, or I shouldn't say Republican, conservative war on drug policies, that was, like I said, part of the whole Clinton administration crime bill that moved the Democratic Party to the right on crime in order to shore up the Democratic chances of winning national elections so they weren't seen as soft on crime. But it hurt a lot of people, and I didn't think Martin O'Malley really owned up to that there. And the fact that he can't own up to the fact that he moved to the right may be why he's a little defensive when Chuck Todd asked him this last question I'm going to show about whether Speaker of the House John Boehner is right to blame liberal policies for 50 years on the problem in the cities. And I'll show the clip from Boehner after that, but this is the order. It was on Meet the Press this morning. First they asked Martin O'Malley about what then they showed John Boehner saying later over in this clip.
I want you to respond to something that Speaker Boehner said to me about blame when it comes to America's inner cities. Take a listen.
Chuck, what we have here is 50 years of liberal policies that have not worked to help the very people that we want to help.
And this morning's Baltimore Sun has this headline, or excuse me, Washington Post. Why couldn't $130 million transform one of Baltimore's poorest places? $100 million was poured into this community over the last 20 years. Are we not spending the money correctly? What are we getting wrong here? Money has been there. What are we getting wrong?
No, Chuck, that's just not true. We haven't had an agenda for America's cities for at least 2 decades.
So we've had money but no agenda. That's what you would...
No, that's not what I'm saying. Look, we have not had an agenda for America's cities probably since Jimmy Carter and the UDAG grants and that era. We have left cities to fend for themselves. And you know what? Because of the dedication of a lot of mayors and good people throughout cities in America, cities have been actually coming back. In our city, we actually see more younger people moving back to the city than we have in decades, and it's actually one of the higher numbers of any city in America. But look, the structural problems that we have in our economy, the way we ship jobs and profits abroad, the way we fail to invest in our infrastructure and fail to invest in American cities. We are creating the conditions. Please, Speaker Boehner and his crocodile tears about the $130 million, that is a spit in the bucket compared to what we need to do as a nation to rebuild our country. And America's cities are the heart of our country. We need an agenda for American cities. We need to stop ignoring, especially people of color, and act like they're disposable citizens in this nation. That's not how our economy is supposed to work. It's not how our country works.
So I thought that was a pretty good response to the Republican talking point that Democrats have been in charge of these cities for so long. But I'll talk about that a little more and show some more responses to it. But first I want to show John Boehner's actual comment, more extended than the clip they showed there, where he blames it on liberal policies and explains that in depth over in this clip.
Fix a broken tax code that encourages more investment in the United States, creates more opportunities in communities like this. How about we find a way to educate more of America's kids? Half of our kids get an education. More than half get a diploma, but they get a diploma they can't read. And when you look at the schools in these inner cities, these families are trapped in bad schools that don't provide a real education, and look what you get. Chuck, what we have here is 50 years of liberal policies that have not worked to help the very people that we want to help. It's time to look at all these programs and determine what's working and what isn't. Because until we start to find programs that actually work and we provide opportunities, more opportunities, and a better education, we're going to have more of the same.
What works? What's worked?
Educating more of our kids.
All right, so how do you do it? That takes government money. Improving schools in Baltimore, does it not?
If money was going to solve the education problem, we would have solved it decades ago.
Well, I don't know. Republicans have these ideas on education about school choice that I'll get to in a little bit. But as for the failure of the Great Society programs, a lot of it has to do with, that it hasn't lowered poverty beyond a certain level. Well, Social Security, of course, got rid of poverty and Medicare got rid of poverty for the elderly to a great extent. But a lot of the other poverty programs, they don't take people out of poverty or depending on other economic policies that determine how many poor people there are. What they do is they make American poor people a little less bad off than poor people in some third world countries because they get Medicaid and they get food stamps. Though a lot of people who qualify for those benefits don't actually get them, and not to mention the VA benefit. I don't want to get into all that, but as to the failure of the Great Society programs, I want to show a clip of Representative Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat in the House of Representatives, also from Maryland, who is over on CNN State of the Union with Mike Smerconish, where he talks about how things would have been worse without the money that was spent over in this clip.
The mayor mentions Republican opposition. You mentioned Republican opposition. The Republican response would be, wait a minute, the funding of the Great Society has been a failure. All of these programs have not generated the sort of jobs that are still needed. Maybe it's a time to go in a different direction. You'd say what, Congressman?
Sure, two things. Yes, absolutely we need to do a lot more, but it has not been a failure. According to the President's Council on Economic Advisors, if you did not have the Great Society War on Poverty, 40 million more Americans would be in poverty, and many in deep poverty today. So we have made gains, but we know from what's happening in Baltimore around the country, we've got a long ways to go, which is why we have put forward proposals to begin to address these kind of matters on an urgent basis. Just last week, I did a conference call with the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, G.K. Butterfield, Barbara Lee, who's a member of the Budget Committee working on these issues, and Bobby Scott, who's focused a lot on the criminal justice reform issues. There are specific proposals right now in Congress that can make things better in places like Baltimore around the country. And instead, what we passed in Congress, the Republicans, a $10 million estates get no estate tax. 10 million plus.
Just making the point, though, when you view it in partisan terms, you have to acknowledge that the urban areas that are most afflicted by the problems we're all trying to solve are governed by Democratic leadership. I want to ask Mayor...
I don't know why Mike Smerconish had to add in that last part. I mean, it's true, but I mean, I was talking about the deindustrialization of our cities and the war on drugs that has targeted black men in certain areas, and that's not really something that mayors have a lot of. I mean, I guess in terms of police policy, mayors like Martin O'Malley Democrat Martin O'Malley, when he was mayor of Baltimore, he did participate in that sort of zero tolerance war on drugs, even though he was a Democrat. So you can't say, even though you can say that Baltimore has had Democratic mayors for 50 years, you can't say that they didn't participate in the new Jim Crow and the Great Divide in the criminal justice system, because Democrats have also been responsible for that. And so I also want to show an additional clip of Chris Van Hollen talking to Mike Smerconish about what the causes are, the constellation of causes of these problems, and then specifically about the Republican budget. I can't remember if he talks about the $14 billion in cuts, or if that's in a clip I'm not showing, but he talks about how the Republican budget is a real problem for people in the cities. Over in, let me make sure over in this clip.
Government solutions?
I think there are a whole constellation of problems here, but there are some systematic underlying problems that should be addressed by government, both at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Just last week, for example, we had a big debate in the Congress over a budget that came to the floor. And that budget, frankly, will make poverty worse in places like Baltimore. We've put together alternatives that would improve the situations for families in Baltimore and elsewhere, and we haven't been able to move that agenda forward. So yes, it is time for people to come together. We need civic organizations. We need the private sector. Yes, we need government as well. And the debate that's going on right now in Washington, while it's often abstract in terms of numbers and documents, the real-world impact it can have will make a difference in people's lives. And that's why, for example, the child tax credit, that helps millions of Americans. The proposal in Congress would scale back the child tax credit, would actually put millions more Americans in poverty. We've got proposals to improve investments in childcare, in early education, and also expand, for example, the earned income tax credit, something Republicans say they're for, but have not put the money into the budget to address.
Yeah, basically Republicans, like I said, have cut $14 billion out of the budget, or $14 billion out of domestic spending, and most of it comes from programs that help lift up people like the people in West Baltimore who are having all these problems with all the unemployment and the bad education. And I'm going to get to school choice in a minute, but I want to show Paul Ryan over on CBS's Face the Nation getting a really softball interview from Bob Schieffer about his Republican budget, where he's cut this $14 billion from domestic spending, but Bob Schieffer doesn't really ask him about that, just gets him to talk about how, he's going to make sure that government programs actually work, and we don't spend money on government programs that don't work, which is kind of like pap, if you ask me, over here.
So what I thought was, after a 50-year war on poverty and trillions of dollars spent, we still have the same poverty rates. We have 45 million people in poverty. So I think what we as a country, this isn't a Republican-Democrat thing, it's we as a country need to say, that's not good enough. We're not getting the results we need. What do we do to get the results? And I think the best thing we can do is go listen to people who are fighting poverty right now, and especially those who are overcoming it.
What can the federal government do?
What the federal government's good at doing is providing resources. What the federal government is bad at doing is dictating solutions. And so what we have done at the federal government is we have measured success based on effort, input. How much money are we spending? How many programs are we creating? How many people are on the programs? Rather than measuring success based on results, outcomes. How many people are we actually getting off of poverty? And what I think the federal government has done is displaced local problem solving with top-down, one-size-fits-all, and it's not working. And so we need to go to an outcome-based approach and rework our poverty fighting strategy, overhaul our poverty fighting strategies to be focused on results and outcomes. And that means listening to people on the ground fighting poverty, not telling them how to overcome
does it also mean the federal government needs to make more money available?
It's really not a more money thing. It's spend the money we have more effectively. So I think we need to do another round of welfare reform, not to save money, but to save lives. And so it's not a function of pumping more money into the same failed system, because we'll just get the same failed result. It's rethinking how we actually attack the root causes of poverty. All we do these days effectively is treat the symptoms of poverty. Why don't we figure out how to go at the root causes of poverty?
What would be one thing you would do to attack the root causes?
Well, I would consolidate many of our federal poverty programs into flexible programs to go to our states to customize a welfare benefit for a person's particular need. Because what you do when you stack up all these poverty programs on top of each other, we had this thing called a poverty trap, where we're actually disincentivizing a person from getting on with their life and going to work. It pays not to take that risk to take a job to go help improve your life because of the benefits you lose.
I don't really buy that argument that people stay on the measly benefits they get because they're afraid to go to work, especially with the earned income tax credit that basically turbocharges your working wages. And now that there's some form of health care, that was one thing that people would lose if they started working, that their Medicaid benefits, and especially for the expanded Medicaid, if you don't live in a state with a Republican governor who hates Obamacare, you have expanded Medicaid that applies to a lot of those people when they start working. So that's not so much of a problem. But like I said, that was a really softball interview. You heard Paul Ryan get to say, it's not that we need to spend more money. We have to spend the same amount of money more wisely, when no one mentioned the $14 billion in cuts in domestic spending in the Republican budget. So I thought that was kind of ridiculous. And I promised before I'd have this clip on school choice. This is actually from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday. They had on former Bush Iraq spokesman Dan Senor, and he took a lot of Republican positions, which I guess it's good to have the Republican side represented on Real Time with Bill Maher, and he tried to push the whole school choice thing, which I think there are a lot of problems with, and D.L. Hughley gave like an inside perspective on what's wrong with that solution to the problems of the inner city over in this clip.
Jane.
And they work.
It's over.
Jane, there are over 1 million names nationally waiting on charter school waiting lists. In New York City, where I live, there are 22,000 kids that applied for 3,000 slots in the best charter school network in the city, Success Academy. There's a problem here where people are trapped in dreadful schools in places like Baltimore and in New York City.
Not just Baltimore.
I know it's
Los
across the
Angeles,
country, right? And they don't have access to education. You want to
Right.
address this unemployment issue? Get people in education.
Dan, there are good charter schools here, and kids get into them, and they work, and they help.
But what? Here's the thing. Why does I grew up on 135th and Avila. Why do I have to leave where I come from to go to a school that's not in my neighborhood? It says everything about where I'm from is horrible, and I have to go somewhere else. Why is everything better where I'm not? And that can't be a reality.
Because the teachers' unions don't allow people to
It's not just
open
the teachers'
schools,
union.
open
It's not
schools
just
in
the
the
teachers'
neighborhood
union.
that you're from, and students from those neighborhoods can't get access
I
to
wish
those
you guys
schools.
hated the police union as much as you do the teachers union. I swear to God I do, because it's not.
I like that last quip at the end about why Republicans hate the teachers union but not the police union, because you saw how much they loved the police union spokesman over on Fox News in those earlier clips. And the whole idea about school choice or charter schools, that you have to get some select group of these inner city students out of the schools in their own neighborhoods so that they can get an education. The problem is that no matter, or school choice vouchers that you give to parents so they can go to Catholic schools or parochial schools or other kinds of private schools, there's always going to be usually a majority left behind in these bad public schools, and you're just like writing those people off. That's you have to fix the actual public school system, and I'm a product of the public school system, a believer in the public school system. I send my daughter to a public school. I know that is not as easy in some areas where there's the public schools. There aren't any good choices, and but I just wanted to make that point, and I want to show one more clip on the whole race cops Baltimore issue. This is back to a specific thing that happened before the violence in Baltimore. This is the mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, who's a former public defender, so that I always have a soft spot in my heart for former public defenders, being a former public defender myself. And I guess she said something before the riots about letting the protesters and the young people have some room to destroy, which seems like a bad turn of phrase, which she was willing to admit when asked about it. I think that, yeah, this is NBC's Meet the Press. Chuck Todd asked her about that, and she talked about some of the context, but also was willing to say she made a mistake, wrong turn of phrase, over in this clip.
Do you regret using the phrase space to destroy?
Yeah, I certainly think that it was taken out of context. But let me say this. I'm from Baltimore. My parents are from here. I'm raising my daughter here. I'm a public defender. As city council person, as mayor, I've always worked to strengthen my city. We fought to get those stores in our communities. I would never condone rioting. I don't, just period. I would never condone it.
So you wish you didn't use that phrase?
I certainly used the wrong phrase to talk about what was clear, that there were people who took advantage of the peaceful demonstrators' First Amendment rights, and they used it to destroy our city. And I don't condone it, and we'll make sure that those individuals will be held accountable.
I get it.
So I don't think Stephanie Rawlings-Blake did that bad a job. You know, over on Fox News, they were very critical of her, and the Republican governor of Maryland has been very critical of her for not being strong enough at the beginning. But if she'd been stronger, there's no guarantee that that might not have caused a stronger response from the few violent people in a crowd of mostly peaceful protesters. And she's actually been pretty conservative about the curfew. Finally lifting it this morning, leaving it. There probably wasn't even that much of a need for it yesterday, but that was the last clip I want to show on the issue of Baltimore and race and cops and the criminal justice system. I only have, I think, 6 more clips before I finish the show. The first one is just a single clip on the update on what happened with the earthquake in Nepal. I think last week I had like over 3,000 killed. Now it's over 7,000. And the fact that this doesn't get more coverage on the corporate media is fairly astounding given the level of people killed. But I guess they're over... I've been pointing over this shoulder. Over this shoulder, you see I have the Noam Chomsky book, Manufacturing Consent, where he talks about worthy victims and unworthy victims. I guess these victims aren't quite as worthy, even though I guess more than 2 9/11s worth of people have died in Nepal. Although it's a natural disaster, so I guess it's not completely analogous. But here's how CBS's Face the Nation did cover it, the only one of the 5 Sunday morning shows to cover it, over in this clip.
Death toll is now over 7,000. Here's CBS News correspondent Seth Doan.
A week after the earthquake, a massive landslide stopped aid from getting in and showed what relief groups are up against. Traveling on bumpy dirt roads, we witnessed the challenge of simply getting around. We had to abandon our van and walk to the hard-hit village of Ranipani. The pace of recovery here is moving one brick at a time. The government should help us make shelters, Ronica Acharya told us, but I don't have any hope they will. Aid has not reached here, so Acharya's nephew Surendra left college in Kathmandu to come home and help.
So your future is on hold?
Future is, I think, totally cancelled.
A few hours away, a sign along the main road made the dire situation clear. Shyam Krishnapuri had a different future in mind for his 3-year-old Muna.
This is your daughter's shoe, and this is all you have left? You have no pictures, just This?
Yes.
The home came and crashed on her, Puri told us. I had this small daughter. Now I have nothing. In the wake of this disaster, we've found lives upended and futures on hold as Nepalese try to grapple with an unbearable present. As that death toll has risen to incomprehensible numbers, we've found people here focusing on the few remarkable stories of survival. We were there when an elite USAID disaster assistance response team got the call that a teenager's voice was detected coming from the rubble. For hours, we watched and wondered if it was possible that someone could survive for so long. He is finally free 120 hours after this earthquake. Later, we found the 15-year-old in fine teenage form, snacking on Oreos at a hospital. Andrew Olvera of the Los Angeles County Fire Department was involved in the rescue.
It's amazing to see somebody be freed. It's amazing to be part of that. It is a miracle.
But miracles are few and challenges many. Aid groups struggle to reach the most remote regions. The U.S. Marines have been brought in to try to manage a logjam of supplies, and families living in tents wonder where to go next. Despite the destruction, there is a sense that life here has to go on. There are signs of recovery. Small vendors have appeared on the streets again, and small shops have started to reopen. 8 days after this earthquake struck, this country is limping back to life. For Face the Nation, this is Seth Doan reporting from Kathmandu, Nepal.
So that was an interesting or sad, I guess, follow-up from Seth Doan on CBS's Face the Nation, and I guess I got to give kudos to Face the Nation and CBS for being the only one of the 5 shows this morning to even follow up on the earthquake in Nepal and the more than doubling of the deaths since the shows last week mostly covered it. When it was just a few thousand deaths, now it's over 7,000, and I don't even know if that's as high as it's going to go, but I wanted to show you that report that only came on CBS. So the next few clips I want to show are political 2016 presidential election clips. A Democrat got into the race, or I guess a Democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders, from Vermont, got in to challenge Hillary Clinton, and he was over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. First, here's the intro that George Stephanopoulos did, giving background on Bernie Sanders, the folk singer turned independent politician over here.
Amount of time, I've got to get back.
Bernie Sanders squeezed out some time this week to run for president.
We're in this race to win.
An unusual launch for a unique politician.
As I went walking that ribbon of highway,
the folk singer from Brooklyn became the socialist mayor of Burlington, Vermont back in 1981, then took his populist message to the House.
The rich have gotten away with murder.
And the Senate.
This is not a tax on the rich. This is a tax on the very, very, very rich.
And now the longest serving independent in Congress,
I run vigorous campaigns,
is ready for Hillary.
So yeah, like I said, I like that intro from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and then the first question to Bernie Sanders. This is the second question, I think, where George Stephanopoulos asked him about. It's either the first or second question about why he's running, and he talks about why that he's stood up against the billionaires for 30 years, and of course George Stephanopoulos loops him into turning that into Hillary's stance on billionaires over in this clip.
Shake-up. Is it really possible for someone who calls himself a socialist to be elected president of the United States?
Well, so long as we know.
Why are you the best choice for president of the United States?
Because for the last 30 years, I've been standing up for the working families of this country, and I think I'm the only candidate who is prepared to take on the billionaire class, which now controls our economy and increasingly controls the political life of this country. We need a political revolution in this country involving millions of people who are prepared to stand up and say enough is enough, and I want to help lead that effort.
So does that mean that Hillary Clinton's part of the billionaire class?
It means that Hillary Clinton has been part of the political establishment for many, many years. I have known Hillary for some 25 years. I respect her and I like her. But I think what the American people are saying, George, is that at a time when 99% of all new income is going to the top 1%, and when the top 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, maybe it's time for real political shakeup in this country and go beyond establishment politics.
So you're asking.
So, yeah, I think that's what you're going to see if there are debates between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, his soft way of attacking his opponent for the Democratic nomination, saying how much he likes her, but saying that she's not the one who's going to break the establishment and the support of billionaires. And I actually mistakenly started to play the next clip where George Stephanopoulos asks Bernie Sanders if someone who calls himself a democratic socialist can actually win, and you get him defining democratic socialism and talking about the Scandinavian countries. I think I have a few viewers in some Scandinavian countries, so you can let me know what you think after you see that interaction, after I make sure I play the correct clip over. And this is the final clip of Bernie Sanders here.
A lot of shake-up. Is it really possible for someone who calls himself a socialist to be elected president of the United States?
Well, so long as we know what democratic socialism is. And if we know that in countries in Scandinavia, like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they are very democratic countries. Obviously, the voter turnout is a lot higher than it is in the United States. In those countries, healthcare is a right of all people. In those countries, college education, graduate school is free. In those countries, retirement benefits, childcare are stronger than in the United States of America. And in those countries, by and large, government works for ordinary people in the middle class rather than, as is the case right now in our country, for the billionaire class.
I can hear the Republican attack ad right now. He wants America to look more like Scandinavia.
That's right. That's right. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong when you have more income and wealth equality? What's wrong when they have a stronger middle class in many ways than we do, a higher minimum wage than we do, and they're stronger on the environment than we do? Look, the fact of the matter is we do a lot in our country, which is good, but we can learn from other countries. We have, George, the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth at the same time as we're seeing a proliferation of millionaires and billionaires. Frankly, I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think that's what America is about.
You're the long...
I actually thought that was a pretty good message. I don't know if Senator Bernie Sanders is the best messenger for it, the best one to carry that message and create a groundswell for a left-wing alternative to Hillary Clinton. That might be more Senator Elizabeth Warren's job, or though I've shown many clips over many months where she says she's not running, and many pundits saying she's not running. And I get the feeling that she is running, but not in 2016. But I wanted to show you those Bernie Sanders clips and his message. And there was that introduction that gave you a little idea of what kind of messenger he is. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. And before I finish up the show, I have two quick clips also from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where they were the only show that actually had a newsmaker on to talk about the Bridgegate scandal. It came up on a few of the shows, but on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, first they had an introductory story from their reporter Jonathan Karl, and then an interview with this assembly member from New Jersey who I showed many months back when Bridgegate was like the lead big story on these shows. It was just a minor story. There were a couple indictments, and well, I'll show you the summary report from Jonathan Karl and talk about a little more before you see the assembly member John Wisniewski that comes after this clip.
It was the traffic jam that stopped Chris Christie's political rise in its tracks.
10-4, we're getting calls from irate motorists.
Now those lane closures off the George Washington Bridge have resulted in criminal charges for some of Chris Christie's one-time closest political confidants. David Wildstein, who has known Christie since high school, pleading guilty to conspiracy.
He and others orchestrated a deliberate and illegal scheme to punish Mark Sokolich, the mayor of Fort Lee, for not endorsing Governor Christie's re-election.
Wildstein claims he engineered the lane closures with two others in Christie's inner circle. Bill Baroni, a powerful political appointee, and Christie's former deputy chief of staff, Bridget Ann Kelly, both have pleaded not guilty.
David Wildstein is a liar.
And nowhere in Friday's indictments is Christie himself even alleged to have known about the plot.
Based on the evidence that is currently available to us, we're not going to charge anybody else in this scheme.
Christie took that as total exoneration, tweeting the charges, quote, "make clear that what I've said from day one is true. I had no knowledge or involvement in the planning or execution of this act." Still, the controversy has been a serious blow to Christie, who was once considered a leading presidential contender. The fiery Christie first joked about the traffic mess.
I worked the cones, actually.
Then he admitted he was embarrassed by the alleged actions of his inner circle.
I am stunned by the abject stupidity, and I knew nothing about this.
But Bridget Ann Kelly hinted there may be more to come.
To suggest that I was the only person in the governor's office who was aware of the George Washington Bridge issue is ludicrous.
And if Christie runs, all of this will play out in a trial, just as his presidential campaign is getting underway.
Happy to be back.
This week, Jonathan Karl, ABC News, Washington.
So, like I said, not only did ABC have that report from Jonathan Karl that talked about both how Christie claimed to be exonerated, how the prosecutor said they didn't have any evidence right now that Chris Christie knew about it or was involved, yet some of these people who have been indicted or pled guilty say that he was involved. And that was the point that New Jersey Assembly member John Wisniewski made in his interview that followed that report with George Stephanopoulos. And that's the final clip I'm going to play for the show tonight. I'll have a few more words after that for my live viewers and my recorded show viewers, and before the end of the show. But here's John Wisniewski saying that Chris Christie isn't out of the woods. Over here.
For joining us this morning. We just heard the U.S. Attorney's planning no further indictments, produced no evidence that Governor Christie or even knew about the crime. Do you accept that conclusion?
It's hard to believe that the governor, I certainly have a hard time believing the governor when his key appointees knew about this, that he had absolutely no knowledge.
But there's no evidence.
You heard Bridget Kelly yesterday say that others in the governor's office knew. You heard David Wildstein the other day say that the governor knew. And so there are at least three different versions of the facts that are out there. One where David Wildstein says the governor knew. Bridget Kelly say folks in the governor's office knew. There's the Master report, which has an entirely different version. And Bill Baroni still claiming that this was still the traffic study.
Yet the federal
So there you have it. That's a partisan Democrat explaining why Chris Christie may still have this Bridgegate scandal reach him. But it seems to have derailed his presidential campaign, and also Jeb Bush kind of derailed it by getting in early and taking up the establishment, not the non-crazy Republican spot that Chris Christie was supposedly going to take. But anyway, like I said, that's the last clip of the show. I would like it if you would let me know down in the comment section, both as live viewers and as a recorded show viewers, if you think I should make this video this week, an edited, produced video about how Fox News attacked the charges against these 6 police officers right away, and especially attacked Marilyn Mosby, the state's prosecutor, with these charges of conflict of interest and being too political and all. I don't know exactly what I'll put in there, but I was thinking about making that video, so let me know what you think about that. Also, if you want to support my videos with either a one-time donation or to become one of my patrons, I have like 40 patrons now who were just charged at the beginning of the month. If you sign up, you don't have to pay until the beginning of June now if you sign up on Patreon. But if you're watching this as a recorded show, there should be like a little eye right there where you can donate if you have the ability to donate. I also appreciate those of you who just watch and subscribe and share and give me like a thumbs up with down below the video player. There's like a little thumbs up thing you can give me. That even that's appreciated. Whatever you can do. I hope you appreciate all the clips I picked out for you for my Sunday live clip roundup. 40 clips, very long show, and so that's why I didn't really get down to the comment section. Although after I said I was glad to have you all keeping me company, I saw there was some weird trolling going on and some like anti-trolling. So I was even having some problems following the comments down there. But I will put a link down below and in like my comment that is my Google Plus comment or whatever that shows up in the top of the comment section. Once I have this all processed as a recorded show, I'll put a link to my Patreon page where I preserve all those, like, should be over 1,000 comments that were the live comments. If that's important to anyone who wants to go back and look at all those live comments, there should be a link to that too. So anyway, like I said, thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out. I'll be seeing you next week at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Pacific or thereabouts, for whatever the best clips are from the corporate media next week. And until then, I guess I'll just be seeing you all around the internet.